So there was a lot of talking about functions and variables and constants, but these are some core things you gotta understand with JavaScript regarding how code executes and how code is related. Now, our goal was to make sure that when we click the plus button, we actually take whatever the user entered here, and we then use that in this addition and generate a new result, which we then output. Now for that, we need to add an event listener to this button. And now that's something we haven't learned at all. We don't really know how to interact with the HTML page because that's a bit more complex, and I'll have a whole module where we dive into all the depths of this. For now, we can take something from the vendor.js file. We can take this add button, which at the end is a reference, a pointer at this plus button we have here. So in app.js, we can use that, replace this code here with add button, and then add a dot here, which is strange. We have never seen that before here. Let's ignore it for now. And then type add event listener, written like this. This is actually a function built into the browser, you could say, which is tied to this button, which is why we have this dot in between. And we'll dive a bit deeper into what this dot means in just a while. So for now, let's just write this. And now this is a function that takes two parameters or two arguments. And the first parameter is actually a string, which identifies the event to which we want to listen. Now there are a bunch of available events, and I'll walk you through them and where to find them all in the dedicated module. For now, we can add click here. Now as a string between single or double quotes or backticks, though backticks don't make a lot of sense here because we don't need to embed anything dynamic here. So that's the first parameter. The second parameter, and that's now the strange thing, actually should be a function. It's not that strange if you think about it though. Since functions are code on demand, you want to make sure that you tell the browser, that you tell JavaScript, which function should be executed if this button is clicked. So how do we now point at a function here? Well, you could do something like add here, right? You could execute your add function here. Now, this would actually be wrong. And this is one of the trickier things to understand in JavaScript or in programming in general. It's not exclusive to JavaScript. We want to tell the browser what to execute when a click occurs. Now, if we execute add like this, no matter if we add arguments or not, which we of course should theoretically though, what happens is that this code gets parsed by the browser when it encounters our script, and in the end, after registering all functions and so on, it will go ahead, it will add this event listener, but then this here tells the browser, call this function, because we have parentheses with arguments here. We want to tell the browser, however, or we want to tell the JavaScript engine, don't execute this function right away. Instead, keep in mind that this function should be executed when this button is clicked. The solution, therefore, is to not pass the function here with parentheses, but just the function name. By doing that, you're telling the JavaScript engine, when this button is clicked, have a look at the function with this name and execute it for me. So before we manually called the function in our code, because we the developers, so to say, were the one executing the function. Now we want to make sure that the browser can execute the function when the click occurs. And we don't know when that will be the case. So we want to give JavaScript the name of the function which it should call for us. We want to allow the browser to call that function for us. Here's a real-life analogy. You live in some house, some flat, and you have an address where you get your mail and so on. Now, of course, you can go down to your doorbell and ring it yourself. You can do that because you know where you live and what your doorbell is, which button you need to press. But you want to make sure that the mail service, the people delivering your mail and your packages, that they know where to ring. So you give them your address. You give them your address by providing it to Amazon or wherever you order your stuff. So now you basically tell them your address, and in this case, the name of the function is the address, so to say, where they need to ring, so that when they are there with your package, with which you ordered, they can ring that bell. And that's the same we're doing here. We're giving the browser the address, the name of the function which it should call for us when the button is clicked. So now this add function will be executed for us by the browser whenever the user clicks this add button. The thing now just is, what about these arguments which we want to get there? We don't know what to add here. Well, in the end, what should be added here is the current result and then whatever the user entered. So we need two additional pieces of information. We need to find out what the user entered, and we need to get our current result. For that, we can restructure the function a bit, and instead of getting arguments here, we can take advantage of something which I mentioned earlier. A function can read from the globally available variables. So we know the current result, of course, so we can use that here in a read-only way, so we're reading from it. We could, of course, also reassign a value to it, but here I'm just reading from it. And now I want to get the value the user entered here. Now, for that, the vendor.js file again got us covered. This user input constant, which is added globally here, that in the end points at this input field here. So we can use user input here, but now that's just a pointer at the input field. Again, without diving into too many details here, you can add dot value here, and that will actually give you the value of what the user entered. And now we get these two pieces of information from our globally available variables and constants. We then derive that result, we return that result, and of course that's another problem. We return the result, but we don't really care about the return value here. We're telling the browser when the button is clicked, click the add function. The browser, however, doesn't care about our result here. It just knows on a click, I execute this function. I don't care whether you return something, and if you do, what that would be. So we can actually change that to on that function and just make sure that we immediately change the current result. And earlier I mentioned that it's not the best idea for a function to kind of change something from outside. Well, if it's a function like this, which is very clear about that, which doesn't kind of mix some internal constant and some external global values, but which clearly only works with global values, which we just use as an event listener, that's kind of fine. And this might sound totally arbitrary right now. You'll get a feeling for this throughout the course, promised. This is something which gets clearer the more you work with JavaScript. You in the end just want to write clear functions, which might work with global constants and variables, but which then shouldn't mix it too much with internally managed data and then some returned value, even though they're also manipulating some global value. As a general rule of thumb, you can have a function that manipulates some global variable, but then this function maybe also shouldn't return something. Because if a function returns something, it kind of signals, hey, I do something and I give you the result of that. I don't do anything else than that. If that function then starts changing something else too, that's the confusing part. If you have a function without a return statement, as we have it here, this function doesn't give us the illusion that it would return its result. It probably instead starts editing the global variables right away, which it does. And then this is clear to us as a developer if we read that code as well. So this now again makes sense. Well, now there was a lot of talking, but we now should have a setup where we actually are able to change the current result when that button is pressed. So if we now save that and we reload here and I enter a 5 and I click plus, nothing changes. Now why is that? Well, we're almost there, but keep in mind that we're calling output result here at the end of our script. Now, as I mentioned before, the script runs from top to bottom, right? So that, of course, means that after that, it's done and it doesn't run again. The only thing that runs again is this function whenever we press that button, because we, when the script executed, told the browser to be aware of that click listener. And it then registers the click listener, and it will, even after the script completed, then always execute this function, because it stored that in memory and all the surrounding data it needs, whenever the button is clicked. Output result, however, is not executed when the button is clicked, but when the script first executes. So what we do here is we try to write to our page, but we don't do that whenever the button is clicked and therefore when our current result changes, but only when the script initially runs. So the solution is to grab that piece of code and also add it into the add function, so that now here we output our result. And now we can also soon start adding a calculation description again. For now, I'll just replace it with the empty string. But the more important thing is that now it uses this current result here, and it now outputs that into our web page whenever the add function runs. So if we now save this, and I reload, and I enter 5, and then I press plus, you see result 0.5? Let's add a 10 here. This gets stranger and stranger. This is clearly not a valid calculator. So the good thing is, we're seeing the output here. So generally, our setup with the function and so on seems to work, but we're clearly not doing some mathematically correct calculations here. So what's the problem?